They came with 200 riders, and not a single one raised a weapon. The dust reached Caleb Whitmore before the sound did, a slow-moving wall rolling across the flat Texas land like a storm that had chosen its direction carefully. He was standing by the fence line, one hand resting on weathered wood, the other hanging loose at his side, watching the horizon the way a man does when he's learned that trouble rarely announces itself twice. The morning sun sat low, stretching long shadows across his ranch, catching on the rusted nails and broken rails that hadn't been fixed in years. 12 years of silence had lived here. 12 years of wind, cattle, and nothing else. Until now. The riders didn't rush. They didn't shout. They moved as one, measured, deliberate, like they already owned the ground beneath their horses' hooves. Caleb didn't reach for his rifle leaning against the post behind him. Didn't move at all. There was something in the way they approached that told him this wasn't about fear. This was about certainty. He could see them clearly now. Faces painted, eyes forward. No wasted motion. No confusion. And at their center, riding slightly ahead, was a single figure cloaked in darker fabric, sitting straighter than the rest. Not leading with force, but with presence. Caleb's jaw tightened, just slightly. He had seen men come to his land before. Tax collectors. Land agents. Boys trying to prove something with borrowed courage. They always came loud. These men came quiet. That was worse. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of leather, dust, and something older. Something that didn't belong to his world. His eyes dropped, just for a second, to the small object tied to the fence beside him. A worn leather strip, faded by sun and time. He hadn't touched it in years. Hadn't needed to. Some things didn't leave, no matter how long you pretended they had. Hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. 200 riders formed a wide half-circle around the ranch, not closing in, not backing away. Just waiting. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose, the kind of breath a man takes when he knows the past has finally caught up and isn't asking permission to speak. No one reached for a weapon. Not him. Not them. And somehow, that made the silence heavier. The lead rider shifted slightly in the saddle, then began to move forward alone. Just one. Just enough. Caleb watched every inch of that approach. The posture. The stillness. The control. Not a warrior looking for a fight. Something else. Something he couldn't name yet. His fingers brushed the old leather strip again, almost without thinking, as if memory had moved before his mind could stop it. 12 years ago, snow instead of dust, blood instead of sunlight, and a pair of eyes that had looked at him not with anger, but with something far more complicated. The rider stopped about 20 feet from him, close enough to see, far enough to choose what came next. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved between them, lifting dust, carrying time back and forth like it didn't care who understood it. Caleb didn't ask why they had come. He already knew one thing for certain. People don't return after 12 years, unless something was never finished. And whatever it was, it had just arrived. Caleb did not speak first because men who had lived alone long enough learned that words could carry more trouble than silence ever did, and the figure before him seemed to understand that language well. The rider slid down from the saddle with a kind of quiet control that did not belong to someone uncertain, boots touching the ground without a sound that mattered, posture straight, shoulders steady, eyes never leaving his. Up close, the details sharpened like the edge of a blade left too long in the open air. The clothing carried marks of travel, not wear, patterns stitched with purpose rather than decoration, and around the rider's neck hung something small that caught the morning light just enough to be noticed without asking for attention. Caleb's gaze flickered there for a fraction of a second, then back to the face beneath the shadow of the hat. Stillness settled again, heavier now, like the land itself was waiting for a truth to choose its moment. Behind them, 200 riders remained motionless, no shifting, no murmuring, just presence, like carved figures placed there long before either of them arrived. Caleb let his hand fall away from the fence, slow, deliberate, making no sudden move that could be mistaken for fear or defiance. He had nothing left to defend and nothing left to prove. The rider took 3 steps closer, stopping at a distance that felt measured, not cautious, as if every inch had already been decided long before this moment. Then, finally, a voice came, low and steady, carrying across the space between them without strain. You stayed. The words were simple, but they carried something older than accusation and heavier than relief. Caleb's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition that had not fully formed yet. He answered after a pause, voice rough from disuse rather than emotion. There was nowhere else to go. The wind passed between them again, lifting a strand of dust that drifted and settled like time refusing to stay buried. The rider's gaze did not waver. Most men would have run. Caleb gave the smallest shake of his head, almost more breath than movement. Most men did not have a reason to stay. That seemed to land somewhere unseen. The rider's eyes softened, not in weakness, but in something closer to memory, and for a brief moment, the distance of 12 years folded in on itself like paper pressed too many times along the same line. Caleb felt it then, not as a thought, but as a weight shifting inside his chest, something he had kept buried without knowing whether it was still alive or long gone. His eyes moved again, drawn without permission to the object at the rider's neck. Leather. Worn. Familiar in a way that did not belong to coincidence. His breath slowed. The rider followed that glance, fingers lifting just enough to touch the small piece resting against their chest, then lowering again as if the gesture itself held meaning that did not need to be explained. Another silence. Longer this time. Deeper. Caleb's voice came quieter now. You came a long way. The rider studied him for a moment, then spoke again, and this time there was no distance left in the words. So did you. That was when it settled. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough to change the ground beneath his feet. Caleb's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing just slightly as memory began to rise, not all at once, but in pieces that refused to stay separate any longer. Snow under his boots, breath in the cold air, a small figure trembling against the dark, and hands that had not known whether they were saving a life or breaking something that could never be repaired. He did not move, did not step forward, but something in him had already crossed the distance. And whatever this moment had come to claim, it was no longer waiting. The memory did not arrive all at once. It never did. It came the way winter does in that part of the country, quiet at first, then settling deeper until everything else had to make room for it. Caleb's eyes stayed on the rider, but he was no longer seeing the dry Texas dust or the line of silent figures behind them. He was seeing white ground stretching out under a pale sky, the kind of cold that made your breath feel like it belonged to someone else. He remembered the sound first, not loud, not sharp, just wrong for the stillness of that night. A small, broken kind of movement carried on the wind. He had been younger then, not by much, but enough to believe that stepping toward trouble could still change something. The ranch had been quieter back then too, fewer broken boards, fewer reasons to keep his head down. He had followed that sound across a stretch of frozen earth that cracked softly under his boots, one step at a time, until he saw her. A small figure against the snow, barely more than a shadow, wrapped in fabric that had long since lost its warmth. She had not cried out when he got close. That was what stayed with him. No shouting, no reaching, just eyes watching him like he was the last thing she expected to see and the one thing she was not sure she could trust. Caleb had stopped a few feet away, not because he did not want to help, but because he understood enough to know that sometimes help looks like harm to someone who has no reason to believe otherwise. The wind had moved through her hair, carrying the faint smell of smoke and sage, something that did not belong to his world but felt steady, grounded. He had taken off his coat slowly, setting it on the ground between them instead of placing it on her shoulders, giving her the choice to take it or not. She had watched his hands the entire time, not his face, not his eyes, only his hands, as if that was where truth lived. When she finally reached for the coat, her fingers had trembled, not with fear alone, but with the weight of a decision she did not fully understand. Caleb had stepped closer then, careful, deliberate, keeping his movements visible, and when he touched her arm to help her stand, she had flinched, not pulling away, but not accepting it either, caught somewhere in between. He remembered the way her eyes searched his face in that moment, not asking for anything, just trying to measure what kind of man he was. He had not spoken much, only what was necessary, voice low, steady, as he guided her step by step across the frozen ground toward the faint outline of his cabin in the distance. Every few feet, she would pause, as if listening for something behind them, something that had not followed but had not fully let go either. He did not ask questions. Not then. Some things do not need words to be understood. By the time they reached the door, the sky had begun to lighten at the edge, a thin line of gray that promised morning without warmth. He had opened the door and stepped aside, letting her enter first, not as a gesture, but as a boundary he would not cross without her choosing it. She had hesitated at the threshold, just for a second, then stepped inside, carrying the cold with her, leaving something else behind in the snow that he would not recognize until much later. Caleb's breathing slowed as the memory settled into place, his eyes returning fully to the rider in front of him, and for the first time since they arrived, there was no distance left in his gaze, only the quiet understanding that whatever stood before him now had begun on that frozen night when neither of them had known what would be owed. The warmth inside the cabin had not come from the fire alone. It came from the space Caleb chose to leave untouched, the careful distance he kept even as he moved through the small room, setting water to heat, placing a blanket near the chair without forcing it around her shoulders, every motion slow enough to be understood, quiet enough to be trusted. She had remained near the door at first, not sitting, not speaking, just watching, her eyes tracking him the same way they had outside, measuring not what he did, but how he did it. The fire cracked softly, filling the silence with something steady, something that did not demand anything in return. Caleb remembered the way she finally moved, not toward him, but toward the warmth, lowering herself into the chair as if every inch of motion had to be earned. He had placed a cup of water within reach, then stepped back again, giving her room, giving her time. She had taken it after a long moment, her hands still trembling slightly, but her grip firm, like she had already decided something important that she could not yet explain. They had not spoken much that night. Words felt too large, too careless for what existed between them. When she did speak, it was quiet, careful English shaped by a different rhythm, each word chosen like it might carry weight beyond its sound. "You should not have come," she had said without looking at him. Caleb had leaned against the far wall, arms loose at his sides, his voice low. "You should not have been out there alone." That had almost brought something like a smile to her face, but it faded before it could fully form, replaced by something more complicated. She had looked down at her hands then, at the coat wrapped around her, at the space between them, and shook her head just slightly. "Where I come from, a man does not touch a woman like that." The words had settled into the room like ash, soft but impossible to ignore. Caleb had not defended himself, had not explained. He had simply nodded once, understanding more than the words themselves. "Out there, it was not about rules," he said after a moment. "It was about keeping you alive." She had looked up then, really looked at him for the first time, searching his face for something that could not be proven, only felt. The silence that followed had not been empty. It had been full of questions neither of them knew how to ask. Later, as the fire burned lower and the night stretched on, she had shifted in the chair, her movements slower now, exhaustion pulling at her in ways she could no longer hide. Caleb had moved once more, placing another blanket nearby, not over her, just close enough to be taken if she chose. She had hesitated again, then reached for it, her fingers brushing the edge of his hand. For the briefest second, it was not contact that lingered, but the absence of fear that followed it. He remembered that clearly, more clearly than anything else. Outside, the wind had continued its quiet path across the land, carrying away tracks that would never be followed, smoothing over the marks of a night that should have ended differently. By morning, the sky had cleared, the light sharp and honest in a way that made everything seem simpler than it was. She had been standing by the door when he woke, the coat folded neatly over the back of the chair, her posture steadier, her eyes clearer, but not softer. She had not said thank you, not in the way he might have expected. Instead, she had stepped closer, pulling something small from around her wrist, a thin strip of leather worn smooth with time, and held it out to him. "So you remember," she said quietly. Caleb had taken it without hesitation, not as a reward, not as a promise, but as something that existed beyond both. When he looked up again, she was already at the door. He had not tried to stop her. Some people are not meant to be kept. The door had opened, letting the cold back in for just a moment, and then she was gone, leaving behind a fire that would burn out and a memory that would not. Time had a way of settling into the bones out here, not loud, not sudden, just steady, like dust finding its place on every surface it could reach, And Caleb Whitmore had let it do exactly that. The years after she left had not come with answers or closure, only with quiet mornings and longer nights, the kind that stretched just far enough to make a man think about things he had no intention of revisiting. The leather strip she gave him never left the fence post outside his cabin. He tied it there the same day she walked out of his life, not as a marker for anyone else, but as something for himself, a reminder that not everything that passes through a man's hands is meant to stay, but some things are meant to be remembered. Seasons turned the land around him in slow, predictable ways. Summers burned the grass down to brittle lines. Winters came thinner than before, but still cold enough to remind him of that night, and the wind carried the same dry song across the open miles year after year. People came and went from the nearest town, some trying to buy land, others trying to take it in quieter ways. But Caleb remained exactly where he had always been, a man standing still while everything else shifted around him. They called him stubborn. Some called him strange. A few called him something worse when they thought he could not hear. He never answered any of it. There was nothing left in him that needed defending. Every now and then, someone would ask about the leather strip tied to his fence, a curious glance, a passing question. He would look at it the same way he always did, then back at them, and say nothing. Not because he could not explain it, but because the explanation would not make sense to anyone who had not stood in that snow, who had not felt the weight of a choice that did not belong to rules or expectations. 12 years is a long time for most people. Long enough to forget a face, a voice, a moment that did not fit into the rest of their lives. But out here, time does not erase things. It presses them deeper, until they become part of how a man stands, how he looks at the horizon, how he chooses when to speak and when to stay quiet. Caleb had not expected her to return. Not because he thought she was gone, but because he understood that some paths, once taken, do not circle back. Whatever life she had found after leaving his cabin, it belonged to her, not to him, and he had made his peace with that long before the years started to blur together. Still, there were mornings when the light hit the fence just right, catching on that worn leather in a way that made it look almost new again, and for a moment, he would feel something shift inside his chest, something that did not belong to regret or hope, but to something quieter, something steadier. A knowing, not that she would return, but that if she ever did, it would not be by accident. And now, standing in the same place where that leather had hung for over a decade, with 200 riders waiting in silence behind. A single figure who carried that same stillness in their posture, Caleb understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not chance. This was not coincidence. This was something that had been moving toward him for 12 years without making a sound, crossing distance, time, and memory with a patience that only certain kinds of truths possess. His fingers brushed the fence again, just once, before falling still at his side. The past had not come back to ask a question. It had come back to finish something. And whatever it was, it had already begun. The wind shifted again, and this time it carried something new with it. Not a sound, not a threat, but a presence that reached beyond the line of riders and into the edges of the land itself. Caleb felt it before he saw it. The subtle change in the way the air moved, the way the horses behind the lone figure adjusted their stance without breaking formation. Something had already been decided. The rider in front of him took one more step forward, slow, deliberate, as if crossing a line that had been drawn long ago. Then, without warning, they removed the hat. It was not a dramatic gesture, not meant to draw attention, but it did anyway. Dark hair fell loose, caught briefly in the morning light, and for a moment, time did something strange. It did not move forward. It folded. Caleb's eyes did not widen. He did not step back. But something in his posture changed, something small and undeniable, like a man recognizing a face he had not expected to see again in this lifetime. The features were older now, sharper, shaped by years he had not witnessed, but the eyes were the same. Not softer, not harder, just certain. The same certainty that had watched him across a frozen field, measuring a stranger by the way he moved, the way he chose not to take what was not freely given. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The distance between them had already been crossed once, long ago, under a different sky, with different stakes. Now it stood between them again, but it felt smaller, narrower, as if time had worn it down instead of stretching it apart. Behind her, The 200 riders remained still, but there was no tension in their silence. No waiting for a command to act. It was something else. Something closer to witnessing. Caleb's voice came first, low, steady, not asking, not assuming. You lived? It was not a question. She nodded once, the movement controlled, almost formal. I did. Her voice carried the same careful English he remembered, but it had changed. There was weight in it now, not from struggle, but from responsibility. She took another step forward, close enough that the dust between them settled completely, leaving nothing moving except the faint lift of wind against their clothes. And you stayed, she added, her eyes moving briefly to the fence, to the worn leather strip tied there, then back to him. Caleb followed that glance without turning his head. Seemed right. That was all he said. It was enough. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, then shifted, just slightly, toward the distant edge of the ranch where the land stretched toward the town miles away. They were coming, she said. Caleb did not ask who. He did not need to. The kind of people she meant did not need names out here. Men who saw land before they saw people. Men who counted fences instead of lives. His jaw tightened just enough to be felt. They always do. She studied him again, not with doubt, but with something closer to confirmation. You would not leave, she said. No, Caleb answered. No explanation. No defense. Just truth. The wind passed between them again, softer now, carrying less weight than before. She reached up then, slowly, and took hold of the leather piece around her neck. The movement was careful, deliberate, as if what she held was not just an object, but a memory shaped into something that could be carried. She pulled it free and held it in her hand for a moment, her fingers brushing its surface like she was reading something written there long ago. Then she stepped forward and extended it toward him. Not as a gift, not as repayment, as something else. Something that had waited 12 years to find its place. Caleb looked at it, then at her, and in that quiet space between them, something shifted again, deeper this time, something that did not belong to the past or the present, but to whatever came next. And behind her, 200 riders remained still, not as a threat, not as a force, but as proof that some debts are not measured in words, and some returns are not meant to be refused. Caleb did not reach for the leather right away. His eyes stayed on it, then lifted back to her face, searching not for permission, but for understanding. 12 years had changed many things, but not the way he measured a moment like this. Slowly, he extended his hand and took the strip from her fingers, the worn surface familiar against his skin, like something that had never truly left him at all. For a brief second, their hands touched again, not by accident this time, not by necessity, but by choice, and there was no hesitation in it. No flinch, no uncertainty, just recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud. Caleb let his hand fall back to his side, the leather resting in his palm, and for the first time since the riders appeared, he shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself in something that felt real again. You kept it, he said quietly. She nodded once. I was told to return it when the time was right. Her voice did not carry doubt, only certainty. Caleb's gaze moved past her then, briefly, taking in the line of riders stretching across his land, their presence no longer unreadable, no longer uncertain. He saw it now. The discipline, the purpose, not an army looking for conflict, but a people standing behind a decision already made. His eyes returned to her. And this is that time. She did not answer right away. Instead, she turned slightly, just enough for him to follow her line of sight. In the distance, far beyond the edge of his property, a thin trail of dust was rising, faint but unmistakable to anyone who had lived on open land long enough. Riders. Not many. Not organized. But coming fast. Caleb's jaw tightened just enough to be noticed. They move quicker than I expected, he said under his breath. She watched the horizon for a moment longer, then looked back at him. They have been watching you for months, she said. Waiting for you to leave. Waiting for you to weaken. Caleb let out a slow breath through his nose. They have been waiting a long time then. There was no fear in his voice. Only fact. She studied him again, and this time there was something new in her expression. Not just recognition. Not just memory. Respect. You could have left, she said. You would have lived easier. Caleb shook his head once, the movement small but final. Easy is not always right. The words settled between them, heavier than anything spoken before. Behind her, the riders shifted for the first time, not breaking formation, but adjusting, like a single body preparing to move. Not forward. Not yet. Just ready. She turned fully then, facing her people, and lifted her hand slightly. No command was spoken. None was needed. The line held steady, but something changed in the air, something that made the space around the ranch feel less like a place under threat and more like ground being claimed by something older than law or ownership. She faced Caleb again, stepping just a fraction closer. "Today," she said, her voice calm, steady, "you do not stand alone." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then past her, then back again, and for the first time in years, something shifted behind his eyes, not relief, not surprise, but something quieter. Acceptance. Not of help, not of protection, but of something he had never asked for and never expected to receive. He closed his hand around the leather strip, the worn edges pressing into his palm, grounding him in a truth that had taken 12 years to return. And as the distant riders grew closer, their shapes beginning to form against the horizon, Caleb Whitmore stood where he had always stood, not as a man waiting for what was coming, but as a man who finally understood why it had taken so long to arrive. The dust on the horizon grew thicker, rising in uneven lines that spoke of men who rode with urgency, but not with unity, a different kind of movement than the silent formation behind her, less certain, more desperate, and Caleb could read that difference the way some men read letters. He shifted his stance just slightly, boots pressing into the dry earth as if testing whether it would hold what was about to unfold, his eyes narrowing not in fear, but in focus. The approaching riders were close enough now that shapes began to form. Hats, coats, the glint of metal catching sunlight in brief flashes that disappeared as quickly as they came. Not a war party. Not an army. Something smaller. Something hungrier. Behind him, the fence stood as it always had, worn, leaning in places, holding nothing back and claiming nothing for itself. Just a line drawn by a man who chose to stay. Caleb did not turn to look at it. He did not need to. The leather strip in his hand was enough. Beside him, she remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence anchored in a way that made the land itself feel steadier. She did not watch the riders with tension. She watched them with understanding. When she finally spoke, her voice carried low across the space between them, meant only for him. "They believe this land is already theirs." Caleb let out a breath that might have been a quiet laugh if it had carried any humor. "Most men who come this way do." She nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition of a truth that did not belong to either of them alone. The distance closed. The riders slowed as they reached the outer edge of the ranch, their formation loose, uncertain, their confidence shifting as their eyes took in what stood before them. 200 figures, unmoving, silent, watching. The lead man among them pulled his horse to a stop, his posture changing in a way that was small but clear, the kind of shift that happens when expectation meets something it did not account for. He looked from the line of riders to Caleb, then to the woman beside him, his gaze lingering there just a fraction too long, trying to understand what he was seeing without asking for it out loud. No one spoke at first. The wind filled that space, carrying dust between them, soft, steady, like it had seen this moment coming long before any of them had arrived. Caleb took one step forward, not toward them, but into the space that belonged to him, his voice even, carrying just enough to be heard without being raised. "You have come a long way," he said. It was not a welcome. It was not a challenge. It was simply fact. The lead rider straightened slightly, his eyes moving again to the line behind Caleb, measuring, calculating, then back to him. Whatever words he had planned did not come the same way now. Something had changed. Something had been decided before he arrived. The woman beside. Caleb stepped forward then, just enough to stand even with him, not behind, not ahead, but beside, her presence quiet and absolute. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "This land is not empty," she said, each word steady, grounded. The riders across from them shifted, not in fear, but in uncertainty, the kind that comes when a simple story no longer fits what stands in front of you. The lead man looked at Caleb again, then at her, then at the silent line behind them, and for a moment, no one moved. No one reached for anything. No one needed to. The answer had already formed in the space between them, carried not by threat, but by presence, by memory, by something older than any claim written on paper or spoken in a town far from here. Caleb did not say anything else. He did not need to. His hand closed slightly around the leather strip, and he stood exactly where he had stood for 12 years, not guarding the land, not defending it, but belonging to it in a way that could not be taken. And as the wind passed once more between the two sides, softer now, quieter, it carried with it the understanding that some ground is not won, not claimed, not taken, but simply recognized. No one gave an order to turn back, and no one needed to, because the moment had already spoken in a language older than command, and the men who had ridden in with certainty now sat with something else settling into their shoulders, something quieter, heavier, harder to ignore. The lead rider held Caleb's gaze for a long second that stretched just far enough to let the truth land, not as defeat, not as victory, but as recognition. He tipped his hat, not low, not exaggerated, just enough to mark the line that had been drawn without words, then eased his horse around, the movement slow, deliberate, like a man choosing to step away from something he could not take with him. One by one, the others followed, their formation loosening as they turned, the dust they carried drifting back across the land in thinner lines, until the horizon began to reclaim them the same way it had delivered them. No one cheered. No one spoke. The silence that remained felt different now, not tense, not waiting, just settled. Behind Caleb, the long line of riders did not move to pursue, did not shift to celebrate. They simply held their place a moment longer, as if honoring something that had just been completed. Then, slowly, as if guided by the same unseen rhythm that had brought them here, they began to turn as well, not away from him, but back toward the wide land they belonged to, their presence easing from the ranch without taking anything with it. Soon, only a few remained, and then only her. She stood beside Caleb in that same quiet space where everything had changed and nothing had been said too loudly, her eyes following the last of her people as they disappeared into the distance. The wind moved softer now, carrying less weight, brushing past the fence, past the worn wood, past the place where the leather had hung for years. Caleb opened his hand and looked down at the strip resting in his palm, then lifted it, turning it slightly so the light caught its surface the way it had that morning so long ago. He did not offer it back right away. Instead, he looked at her, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. "Seems like it found its way home," he said quietly. She held his gaze, then gave the smallest shake of her head, a movement that carried more meaning than words would have managed. "It never left," she replied. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb stepped toward the fence and tied the leather back where it had always been, his fingers working the knot with the same care he had used 12 years before, not tighter, not looser, just right. When he finished, he stepped back, and for the first time, the piece of leather looked exactly the same as it had all those years, weathered, simple, but now it carried something new that could not be seen, only understood. He turned back to her, and there was nothing left to resolve, nothing left to return, only the quiet space between two lives that had crossed once and now stood again, not as strangers, not as debts, but as something steadier. She placed her hand briefly over her heart, not as a gesture meant to be explained, but as one that did not need explanation, then lowered it and stepped back toward her. Horse. She did not rush. She did not linger. She moved the way she had arrived, certain, grounded, carrying her path with her. Before she mounted, she looked at him one last time, and in that glance, there was no distance left, no misunderstanding, only the quiet acknowledgement of what had been given and what had been returned without being asked. Caleb nodded once, just once, the kind of nod a man gives when words would only make something smaller than it deserved to be. She mounted, turned, and rode, her figure joining the last traces of her people until the land closed behind her again, leaving the ranch as it had always been. Caleb stood there a while longer, the wind moving through the fence, the sun climbing higher, the day settling into its usual shape. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He rested his hand once more against the wood, eyes on the horizon, and let the silence speak the only truth that mattered. Out here, a man does not keep what he is given. He proves himself worthy of its return.